The Beef School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pioneer Hybrid Canada. To find more Beef School episodes, go to beefschool.ca.
Jay Strovey with RealAgriculture.com, and we're here for another edition of the Beef School. And I'm joined today by Leland Furh of DairySmart Nutrition and BeefSmart Consulting. So today we're going to talk about feed analysis.
Yes.
Let's start with the obvious, why?
Why? It's very simple, actually. I like to simplify these things, and the simple answer is you don't know what you don't measure. So if you're measuring other metrics on your farm, you really need to know what your feed is doing and how it's going to perform for your animals.
All right, so let's start with collection. How, if a farmer wants to send in a sample for analysis, how do they go about collecting that sample?
Yeah. Collecting the sample is going to vary depending on what type of sample it is, and we work with everything from dry grains, samples like that, to forages or fodder that can be dry or wet, so ensiled forages like silage, to even liquids, so things like molasses or whey permeate. There may be other ingredients as well too that you want to consider with sampling. So it's, what we really want to get to when sampling any of these ingredients, though, is reducing the variation of your sample. So you're going to have a mass of whatever ingredient or whatever feed it is you're looking at, and you're wanting to sample it in a way that you can drop the variation of what you're taking. If you take it from only one spot, you might get a very skewed result that's going to set you off on the wrong step. Whereas if you take from multiple sampling points, you're going to reduce the variation with that. So what I would do, for example, then, is let's take hay, for example, in bales. I would make sure that if we had say 100 to 200 bales, that I'm sampling probably around 20% of those bales. So I could be doing 20 bales to up to 40 bales. So if it's a large sample, I'll just collect that together into one sample and then subsample from there in order to get a sample that's going to reduce the variation of what I have as we feed out that stuff. Another thing you can do to reduce variation or mitigate that factor is continue to sample as you're going through a feed mass if it is a very large mass, just to ensure that your initial analysis result was accurate.
So what are we looking at when it comes to a feed analysis?
Yeah. Again, I like to reiterate that I'm trying to make things simple, take a step back, and let's look at just the broader points of it. So when I'm looking at a feed analysis, I can break it down into 5 very simple categories. The first, and probably the most important, particularly when you're feeding wet feeds, is what is the moisture content of the feed. This also influences what kind of storage quality you can get out of it. We all know that damp grains are at risk of heating and developing mold, which creates other issues. So that's the first category, is moisture, how much water is in it. The second is protein. We hear guys talk about protein all the time, but we have to be careful with protein. Is too little, we underperform, but too much, the animals have to excrete the excess, and we also underperform. So we need a correct amount depending on what our target is. The third category would be carbohydrates. That's a big buzzword with people these days in our human diets, but with cattle, first and foremost, they are carbohydrate fermenters, and the big one we're looking at within that category is fiber, but there's other things like starch and sugar within that category. The fourth category, what I'm looking at, is fats. So fats produce more energy in metabolism than carbohydrates or protein will, but they tend to be more costly as well too, and we can be limited on how much we can feed to the animal and still get good performance out of them. So it is definitely worth looking at that category. And then the last category is an inorganic, and this is basically rocks and metals. It's the ash category, and this is the minerals which are essential for balancing out rations and having performing animals. But with that, I would emphasize with your analysis, that always has to be measured by wet chemistry. We can do inorganics by different processes, including NIR, but the mineral fraction is something that you should be measuring accurately with wet chemistry.
Okay, so a producer takes in a sample, they drop it off with you, you do your analysis. The next step is, how does a producer interpret what they get back?
Well, that's one thing, is not all producers are educated in what a lot of this information means. My recommendation, though, would be for producers to work with someone that is knowledgeable on these, and before actually analyzing any of the feedstocks you have, is consult with somebody to select a test that's going to represent it in a way in which you can best value it and then best use it in your livestock.
So does that consulting process take place even prior to sampling?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Part of it would be sitting down and even asking how to properly sample it to reduce the variation, because these type of people that are educated in this field are knowledgeable in reducing that variation and working with those numbers, right? Myself personally, I get to see many feedstuffs every year, more than some farmers will see even in their lifetime based on the number of producers I'm working with. I get to sample them myself. I get to see the analysis results of them, and I get to balance rations with them and then watch the livestock and see if they're performing the way that we're predicting. So taking all those factors together, it really emphasizes the importance of how you'd make that first step. If you're off to the wrong step by doing improper sampling, then everything else is going to fall out of line as well too. So.
All right, so obviously health and performance are your number one concerns when it comes to feed sampling.
Absolutely.
So you get your sample back, you go over the analysis, and what step do you take from there? Let's say your sample doesn't come in quite like you expected, or there's something you would say maybe alarming when it comes to that. What are your next steps?
So this goes back to the consultation level, and unfortunately the thing is if you are stuck with something that isn't what you really wanted, you're going to have to manage it for the rest of the year. And this is why I would emphasize with producers to work with someone even before you get the feedstocks on the ground in order to determine what the best cropping practices are, but as well as what the best harvest time is. The number one factor that influences your quality of your feed is your harvest time. So I'll tell producers all the time that the most important day of the year is the day you decide to turn the key to that harvester, because that is going to have the biggest influence on what quality of feed you get off. Doesn't matter what seed you put in the ground, doesn't matter what variety you put in the ground, you have to get it at the right time. The other thing to back that up as well too is, as I like telling guys, that storage quality trumps chemical quality. So the chemical quality will be determined at the time you harvest it. However, if you're storing that feed for months or maybe a year or longer, which is quite often the case, that storage mass, if it starts to spoil, it's going to negatively impact what kind of quality of feed you have. So that's a bit of a moving target too. So we work with a lot of producers on staging crops, getting them off at the right time, but as well as properly storing them such that there isn't degradation in those feedstuffs over time as well.
All right, thanks a lot, Leland.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the Beef School, brought to you by Pioneer Hybrid Canada.